from personal responsibility under dictatorship. The rather optimistic view of human nature, which speaks so clearly from the verdict, not only of the judges in the Jerusalem trial, but of all post-war trials, presupposes an independent human faculty, unsupported by law and public opinion, that judges in full spontaneity every deed and intent anew whenever the occasion arises. She goes on to speculate, perhaps we do have such a faculty and are lawgivers, each single one of us, whenever we act. Thus, a certain kind of affirmation of Kantian practical judgment. Arendt is supplying, it seems to me, a philosophical norm for just law, basing it on a Kantian notion of self-legislation. On the other hand, however, she's elaborating a social ontology without which no exercise of freedom and no claim to rights is finally possible. Plurality is the condition for the exercise of rights, an exercise through which we also constitute ourselves as social beings. Sociality is both the precondition of the legitimate exercise of rights, but also the effect of that very exercise. How do we understand Kant in the midst of this sociality? He's in strange company. And is our quandary related to the problem of the self who keeps company with itself and the self who is no self without being in the company of others? Okay, so I want to bring this to conclusion, and I would just want to say maybe 3 points, and then I promise we shall be done. It's been a long day. All right, sorry, there's a bunch, but I'm not going to, I'm not going to give it all to you because it's late. Okay. Okay, so the first point is simply this, that those of you who know Arendt's notion of freedom know that she understands freedom not as the exercise of the individual, but rather as a social enactment or an exercise of a certain kind of social ontology. We cannot be individually free. We exercise freedom in concert. And indeed, this is an important notion for her, and it becomes essential to her idea of the right to belong, modes of belonging, right to belong to communities, and to be able to exercise freedom by virtue of that belonging. And I want to suggest this, that in a way, if, according to her, every human requires place and belonging, then this is a specific argument, it could be a specific argument for territorialities or for communitarian forms of belonging. But if we have a right to place or a right to belonging, if we understand it as universal, then the right is not justified through recourse to either place or belonging. Indeed, it belongs to every person regardless of place and belonging. The problem is that we cannot conceptualize the person outside of these terms if we accept her social ontology. The assertion of rights seeks to counter the situation of refugees and to assert a right to place and to belong. On the other hand, the right, as soon as it becomes universalized, seems to belong to humanity as such, regardless of place or mode of belonging. Now, when she speaks like that, it's very clear that rights don't necessarily belong to individuals, but they actually pertain to us as social creatures. And yet, when she speaks about judgment as a faculty, it seems to me to be a faculty that belongs to an individual. Is there not a tension here between these two notions? So if freedom is not an attribute of individuals, but an exercise and concerted action performed by a we, and which institutes that we as the social condition of rights themselves, we can see how politics is at once performative and universalizing. She writes, "Our political life rests on the assumption that we can produce equality through organization because man, can act in and change and build a common world together with his equals and only with his equals." So in her view, we would be making a mistake if we imagine a group of individuals amassing together as a collection of individual actors. None of those individuals becomes a subject of rights unless and until concerted and collective action becomes possible. To be human is a function, a feature of acting on terms of equality with other humans. Here we can see that every human has already to be a we, a plurality, indeed a thinking being, in order to be a part of the we who makes and remakes the world. The one is not simply a precondition of the other, but the two pluralities cross when thinking becomes action, which it does in language, and when it asserts its rights, even when there's no legal basis for doing so, and even when the assertion of rights threatens to destroy the legal code that exists. Now, of course, this conclusion leaves some critics nervous. It would seem that Arendt appeals finally neither to existing law nor to abstract principle, but only to judgment itself. About the Nazi genocide, she wrote that our usual moral standards were upended and rendered anachronistic, that we had to she writes, "At the time, the horror itself in its naked monstrosity seemed not only to me but to many others to transcend all moral categories and to explode all standards of jurisdiction. It was something men could neither punish adequately nor forgive." Later, she says, "We had to learn everything from scratch, in the raw, as it were, without the help of categories and general rules under which to subsume our experience," end quote. So it's this last demand that returned her to Kant, not only to retrieve him from Eichmann's appropriation, but also to develop a mode of responsibility made necessary by the historical situation in which moral and legal frameworks had proven inadequate. I want to suggest to you that here she is saying that morality, moral judgment, involves probing, experimenting, relying on the imagination when it comes to forming judgments of this time and in the name of shared human life. And indeed, a crime against humanity is not a crime against an individual, and a crime against humanity is not the crime of an individual necessarily, but Arendt here positions herself in an interesting place, I would suggest, as an I and as a we, or in between the two, in order to elaborate the norms by which we might judge. Now, the problem, of course, is that she summons and produces a figure of sovereign authority outside of all law to make that judgment, at the same time that she's arguing for this social ontology. What would happen if, instead of turning to the sovereign voice as a way to oppose legal violence, she were to have rethought the social itself, that field of plurality, not only as a site of belonging, but as a site of struggle? In other words, does that chiasmic relation between the I and the we also expose a fault at the heart of sovereignty, a non-coincidence that makes the voice vacillate between modes, that keeps the ground more slippery than sovereignty likes? My problems extend beyond this issue. If to think, or at least to think well, involves thinking in such a way that we seek to preserve the heterogeneity of human life, what she calls plurality, we will doubtless find that life is connected to non-human life in essential ways. I think Giorgio has actually made this point very importantly. We will doubtless also find, if we are thinking well, that life takes on a bodily form, which means that the life of the body, its hunger, its need for shelter, its protection from violence, would all become major issues for politics. Arendt is the one who, in The Human Condition, consequentially and mistakenly separates the sphere of the public from the sphere of the private. But it's in the sphere of the private that we find the question of needs, the reproduction of the material conditions of life, the problem of transience, of reproduction and death alike, everything that pertains to what I would call precarious life.